ever think that modern life is not for you? Do you do the same dead-end job every day? Is your love life dying on its feet?
To a wonderful mum.
Have you ever felt that you're turning into
the end of the world?
a zombie? Maybe you're not alone.
Piss it.
Hey there, Film Buds. Welcome back to the Film Buds podcast. I'm your host, Paul. This week we have something a little bit outside of the norm. We've kind of done this before. I'm joined by author and writer Clark Collis. He is a very special guest today. He writes for Entertainment Weekly, and his newest book, You've Got Red on You, is all about the making of Shaun of the Dead. Clark, hi.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. I'm not a special guest. I'm not a very special guest. I'm just a guest, I think. Just a special guest. The very is unnecessary. But thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, of course. So this is the second time that I've managed to snag us a writer. The first, of course, writer that we had on with us was Allison Pierce, who's also a professor of film, and she taught a whole subject on horror films.
Uh-huh.
So actually, it's fun. Both of the writing guests that I've brought on have been sort of like horror genre enthusiasts and aficionados. It's good to have you on.
It seems to be something that lends itself to academic study, oddly.
Yeah.
More than, and I'm sure people can call me a fool on Twitter and point to so many other genres that are as equally covered. But I don't really think of an awful lot of academic study necessarily about romantic comedies. As opposed to horror movies. Then again, horror is something that I'm interested in, so maybe I'm just not, I'm not, maybe that's just what's leaping out at me. And I think it's partly because, horror tends to deal in themes that are worthy of study, if not always, text and subtext, going back to, all sorts of things. David Cronenberg's Fly is about AIDS, and a lot of horror films in the 50s are about, paranoia and reflective of the communist era. And maybe it's also thinking about it that if you really like horror movies, you sort of feel drawn towards maybe defending yourself a bit and constructing. And I'm not saying these academic studies are in any way hollow or false, but if you like something that is maybe one of the more disreputable genres, then you feel obliged to start writing academic papers about it to justify seeing, staying up late watching Chopping Mall or whatever. Not that anybody needs any excuse to stay up late and watch Chopping Mall.
No, I think you make a great point. When I was in college, we had a horror class as an entire line of study, and it was also a genre that was talked about heavily in the women's and gender studies program, and it was also discussed heavily by the only female professor on staff at the time. One of the things that she was obsessed with was horror. She was working on a paper about Evil Dead at the time, the more recent one. But yeah, I think that you're right also. I think you do have to kind of go in there and show that there's value to it. And horror also draws such a particular crowd. You always know a horror fan when you meet one and start talking to them.
Well, in fairness, because they're usually wearing like they're usually wearing an Evil Dead T-shirt. It's not. I know what you're saying, that maybe they do sort of give off a horror vibe, but more often than not, they are wearing a Motel Hell. I was in staying with friends up in the bucolic, woody upstate New York, and I passed some guy when I was out running, and he was wearing a very faded Motel Hell T-shirt. And I thought, horror fans really do get everywhere. Although I guess the middle of the woods isn't that unusual place to find a horror movie fan.
No, it's where, so many of the great genre films take place. So why not go there?
Sure.
So is horror something that you primarily cover in your work over at Entertainment Weekly?
Yeah, it's not. It's one of those things that no one ever tells me to cover it. Mostly because they don't have to tell me to cover it. I just do it. I do. I mean, everybody at Entertainment Weekly now sort of works in all areas of the magazine in terms of, we all write for the magazine. We all write online. We do video stuff. We do podcasts and radio and so on and so forth. And most of us have a pretty broad brief. I mean, yes, I cover horror, but I also cover I also cover James Bond, and I'm chuckling because covering the most, I mean, for sad global reasons, covering the most recent James Bond movie has proven to be a much lengthier enterprise than I'd imagined that it would be. When I visited the set, what now seems like 17 years ago. But yeah, so I write about James Bond. I write about The Crown, the TV show, which really, despite what you might think about the British royal family, is a pretty long way from the horror genre in many ways. And it's just sort of things that sometimes it's things you're really interested in. Sometimes you put up your hand to cover something and you think it's going to be one interview, and then 17 years later you're still covering Grey's Anatomy or whatever. I mean, not that I cover Grey's Anatomy, but that can happen. And it's kind of fun. I mean, I do write a lot about horror, but often it's quite fun. The randomness means that sometimes I'm covering all sorts of weird stuff that I wouldn't necessarily think I was suited to. And some people might say I wasn't suited to, but wind up being quite fun. I was on the set of, just because I happened to be in the UK, I think at the time, I went on the set of of Disney's live-action Beauty and the Beast movie about, I guess that must be about 6 years ago now. Something that really is not in my wheelhouse in terms of things that I would rush to see. But then again, you're on, you're on this huge movie set, and Dan Stevens, and these amazing, this amazing production, and it's being directed by Bill Condon, who actually has a sort of a horror background himself to a degree, and it's absolutely fascinating, And in some ways, covering horror is different from other genres, but in some ways it's quite similar. I mean, there's the cast and crew. You go on a horror film set, and it's not like it's always drenched in blood, or the cast are leaping out at you with fake chainsaws. It's you'd be surprised how similar it can be. But yeah, definitely, I do enjoy covering horror movies, particularly. I like the sort of 90-minute, 2-hour experience. I'm less keen on. I see a lot of horror TV shows, and I mean there are some great horror TV shows, but sometimes I think, well, this is a horror movie stretched to what appears to be 50 hours, and I don't really have 50 hours to spare for it.
Yeah, and it's hard to really stretch tension over 8 hours of content. It's really hard to keep that pressure building in a way that also makes the story enjoyable to watch and isn't just, constant cheap thrills.
Well, yeah, and I think anything stretched long enough becomes a soap opera to a degree, and I have nothing against soap operas, but that's not necessarily my genre of choice, and I'd much rather something at a beginning and a middle and an end, and then I could be in a bar before it closes. Having said which, of course, I mean, the irony of saying that is that there's now like 17 Halloweens, so stick them together and you've got like more than a TV season's worth of Halloween. And the same for Friday the 13th and so on and so forth. So, but having said which, I'm not necessarily somebody. I know every like Friday the 13th people list, their they go on Twitter and they put all the Friday the 13th movies in order, depending how much they like them, and the same for other genres. And I'm not, so I certainly haven't seen all of the Friday the 13th movies. I think the interesting thing about horror is that it has a very conservative side. People like the repetition of it. People like the expectedness of it, and that's fine. But I think the appeal of horror to me is that anything can happen, you know, and with the best will in the world, by the time you're seeing Friday the 13th Part 8, you know, you're pretty certain about what you're going to get.
Yeah, once you hit Jason in space, it's almost barely a horror film at that point.
Well, you know what? Oddly, I think Jason X, which is Jason in Space, is the one I've seen the most. I do have a huge fondness for that, and that itself,
for sure.
that in itself would mark me out as an idiot by most horror fans. So, what can you do?
No, you know, you like what you like.
It's true. That's absolutely true. And again, as I say, there's nothing wrong with some people liking the repetitive nature of horror at all. And God knows, I've seen Shaun of the Dead an awful lot at this point, but I've seen a lot of, I have comfort horror movies. I love watching The Thing and a lot of Carpenter, and there's nothing wrong with that. But one of the appeals, as I said, to me, of the horror genre is that really anything can happen. And one of the perennial disappointments is that usually you know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah. No, I think that's really fair, you know. I think maybe because of the cheap nature of horror, people, you know, go and try and do that sort of, you know, quick turnaround on the thing, and so you end up just getting a deluge of a whole bunch of stuff that's predictable, that was, you know, made on a quick fly kind of a thing, and it's also
very true, yes.
Yeah. And also, you know, I think that sometimes it can be a little bit hard to find, you know, those things that speak to sort of universal fears. You know, it's hard to find those things that really punch and hit home beyond just being scary.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why it helps. And that's why it helps, I think. And this sort of resonates with Shaun of the Dead. It helps to have a core thesis to your movie. And with Shaun of the Dead, the core thesis, you know, is that living in a major city is, you know, you see so many people that are like zombies anyway before the zombies turn up.
So was it your coverage of Shaun of the Dead that ended up leading you to your sort of love affair with it? You know, how did the book come about?
I came to Shaun of the Dead through a pretty strange route, which has its beginnings with the fact that I grew up in a small town, a small rural town in England, in the county of Somerset, called Wells, Wells. And it is the town where Edgar Wright, the director and co-writer of Shaun of the Dead, also grew up. I didn't know him when I was young. He was, you know, I think he's like at least 5 years younger than me. Although we did, it turned out, both work at different times at the local tourist attraction, which was called Wookiee Hole Caves, which is a series of limestone caves. And I was a tour guide, and Edgar worked in the parking lot, essentially directing traffic. And as he told me once, if anybody ever says in a review that Edgar Wright couldn't direct traffic, then they're wrong. So that he can call up the journalist to be like, I think you'll find that my spell doing just that, directing traffic in Wookiee Hole Caves in the summer of whenever, proves you wrong. So when I was in the mid-90s, I was working at a movie magazine, and Edgar released his first movie. Most people think Shaun of the Dead is his first movie. In fact, his first film was called A Fistful of Fingers, and it was a comedy western made in Wells for £12,000, about $20,000. And I was working at a movie magazine, and I was like, someone made a comedy western in Wells. I'll send someone to interview this guy, which we then did. And then he was sort of on my radar. And then he and Simon Pegg and Jessica Hines and Nick Frost made 2 seasons of what turned out to be a cult and fantastic sitcom called Spaced in the late 90s, which I saw. And then by the time Shaun of the Dead came out, I was living in New York, working for Entertainment Weekly, I think, and saw it at the cinema and really liked it. But then over time, he made, as people may well be aware, he and Simon and Nick made 2 more movies, Hot Fuzz, which is filmed in Wells, and The World's End, and collectively these are known as the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy because they all feature the British ice cream cornetto. And I just think, I mean, I love Shaun, I love all of the movies, but I just think cumulatively that's one of the best trilogies of all time, really. I think they're just wonderful, wonderful comedies. I think they're very funny, the acting's great, directing, the writing, they're all marvelous. They tackle, for those people who don't know, they tackle different genres. Shaun of the Dead tackles the zombie genre. Hot Fuzz is a cop movie, essentially. And The World's End is a sort of sci-fi alien invasion film. And it's weird to even talk about them as a trilogy because, you know, they have the same director and the same cast, but they're not the same characters. But they definitely have a similar sensibility, and they're linked by in-jokes. And I just think what a wonder that this trilogy, which they never planned on making, you know, sort of accidental. I mean, there's nothing accidental about the creation of the individual movies, but cumulatively, this sort of accidental trilogy, you know, I just think it's an absolute thing of wonder. And then, as you sort of alluded to, I did do an oral history of Shaun of the Dead a few years ago, and I spoke to Edgar, their producer, Naira Park, who's sort of, in many ways, the fifth Beatle, maybe even the fourth Beatle. Nick Frost and Bill Nye. And so I had like what I thought was the bones. I basically thought I'd done half the work of writing a book. And then not long before the pandemic started, I thought, well, I'll start sort of sketching out a book, seeing what that looked like. And then signed a deal with 1984 Publishing last summer, and then set to work, you know, doing what I thought would be a few sort of top-up interviews, but eventually spoke to about 60 people,
Wow.
and ultimately realized that when I thought I'd done half the job writing the original article, I'd actually done about 5% of the job. And so it became, I mean, I really enjoyed doing it, but it did become real mountain to climb, partly because I'd said, oh yes, I can do this in 6 months. It's half done already. And so during the day I would be interviewing, you know, Edgar and the production designer and the script supervisor and maybe a couple of the people who played zombies, and then getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to furiously transcribe and, you know, sort of add it into the book, and then talk to some more people while also working for Entertainment Weekly. So I really enjoyed it, but it was quite a lot of work, I have to say. But I was really glad that, and it was partly inspired by Edgar. Really, Edgar is very generous in terms of wanting to credit his collaborators, and so he was always saying, "Oh, you must talk to this person. You must talk to that person." And so I would, and they'd all have. I mean, all of them had fascinating stories, and a lot of them have continued to work with Edgar over the years, and had worked with him before on Spaced. So yeah, eventually got it done. I think when I started, I planned on it being about 200 pages, and it's wound up being 450. So I don't think anyone else is going to be writing a book, whether it's good or bad. I do think this is, in a way, I don't think anyone else is going to be writing a Shaun of the Dead book in the near future.
No, I just finished chapter 2, and
so you haven't
really
even started making this thing yet.
No, yeah, and I've really been enjoying it. I find it
That's
fascinating
Right.
because you can also, I think, in the journey to Shaun of the Dead, see some of the hints and textures and notes of what he's going to do later.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when in the book, when you write about him coming up with the idea of crawl,
Right.
you know, based on bar culture, suddenly I was like, oh, World's End, you know, and he talks about listening to the song Bell Bottoms, and I was like, oh, Baby Driver. And so
it's I would certainly not compare this book to an Edgar Wright movie, because I think Edgar Wright his movies are about 100 times better than this book. But it's interesting how writing a book about something, certainly in this case, did sort of influence the way I was writing it. Because in Edgar's films, if somebody mentions, certainly with the Cornella trilogy, if somebody mentions something at the start, that's gonna come around again, and it likely will come around like 5 times in a way that you're not expecting. And so, so there are various characters. I mean, I don't think it's a spoiler, but one of his teenage friends is this guy called Corin Hardy, who is another sort of, Edgar was making short films. Were playing at youth festivals, and Corin was making short films. They were playing at youth festivals, and they became friends. And what I don't point out in the book, what I don't point in the book is that 30 years later, Corin would eventually direct The Nun, which is one of the most successful films in the Conjuring franchise. And so Corin kind of pops up here and there throughout the book and plays one of the zombies in Shaun of the Dead. But I like that mentions for some reason. I enjoyed aping the films to the extent that hopefully if someone was introduced, then they would come back. And actually, Edgar was the book was finished, and Edgar had a look at it and made a couple of suggestions, not in terms of altering it at all, but he was like, "Oh, well, you mentioned Tom Stoppard. You have this epigram at the start about Tom Stoppard, and you mentioned the fact that the British playwright, you mentioned about the fact that we pitched it to various people as a mix of Dawn of the Dead and Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, which, for those who don't know, is a play about 2 minor characters from Hamlet. But it's like, hey, what if they were the major characters? What's Hamlet look like from the point of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? Just as with George Romero's zombie movies, they're in America, which for a British person is very exciting, and they're in news studios, or they're in a bunker trying to figure out how to fix the zombie virus and blah, blah, blah. Shaun is like, well, what if it was just some guys in a pub in Britain, not like trying to cure the virus or do anything really other than survive the night? And so that was the comparison. And Edgar was like, well, I met Tom Stoppard a couple of years ago, and then talked about going to some fancy dinner, some sort of BAFTAs thing, and finding himself sitting next to Tom Stoppard and Tom Stoppard not recognizing who Edgar was and be like, what do you do? And he's like, I'm a film director. In fact, I directed Shaun of the Dead. And that Tom Stoppard was like, I know what that is. And Edgar said, well, we actually pitched it, as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern meet Dawn of the Dead. So it was so Edgar himself was like, well, if you mention this at the start, then actually I have a story about, meeting Tom Stoppard, or meeting the film director Mike Leigh, who was another sort of influence on the movie. So yeah, Edgar helped with that kind of bringing it all back around again at the end.
No, that's awesome. I think it's interesting, that he was. I love that he was so a part of the process. So many filmmakers and film types can oftentimes seem a little bit sort of, secretive, I think, on a certain level,
Well,
and
this was what I think one of the reasons he wanted to write the book was that if you watch Shaun of the Dead, it is very easy to think, boy, did those guys have a hell of a time making that movie. For those who don't know, they're essentially friends making a film to one degree. Simon Pegg and Nick Frost were actually roommates when Edgar and Simon were writing the script. They were all good friends, and so it's easy to be like, oh, well, I guess this was just a bunch of mates making a movie, and how much fun would that be? And in fact, one of the last people I interviewed was Michael Bay, and I wasn't really interviewing him about Shaun of the Dead, but obviously Michael Bay had not Michael Bay, I apologize, Zack Snyder. Freudian step there. Zack Snyder remade Dawn of the Dead, so and his new movie was Army of the Dead. So I figured he might have seen Shaun of the Dead at one point. And sometimes, over the last couple of years, I've been interviewing somebody that didn't have anything to do with Shaun of the Dead, but it seemed like someone I might want to get in the book. I've asked them about it, and Zack Snyder was saying, look, you watch that movie, and you're like, boy, those guys had a blast making that film. And people think that. And you know, for a lot of people did have a lot of fun making that film. But Edgar Wright was not necessarily one of them. And I think, you know, and Edgar in the book talks about how difficult it was to finance. Nobody wanted to finance this thing. The moment somebody did want to finance it, that company went bust. Like, people thought it was a really stupid idea. People hated the title. You know, people wanted them to cast the movie differently, with bigger stars. And the film and the book and the production itself was very, very, for Edgar particularly, very, very grueling. Edgar is a incredibly, you know, details-oriented person who was trying to film his vision. Also working with a crew that at times were just like, who is this guy who is apparently 27 years old but looks like 12? I mean, Edgar looked very young at the time. He's still a youthful-looking guy, and he was having problems with the crew. And then when they finished the film, you know, there was no guarantee it was going to be released in the States at all. And so Edgar had to get pretty, you know, had to sort of carry he literally took the film to Austin to show it to the Ain't It Cool News guys in film cans to try to get some sort of buzz going for the movie. So I think Edgar was, I mean, not in any way fed up with Shaun of the Dead at all, but I think he was fed up with people assuming that they all had like a fantastic time making the movie, whereas Edgar kind of had a pretty hellish time making the movie. And this was I think he felt an opportunity to sort of to correct that view to some extent.
Yeah, put the false myth to bed and be like, no, this was a passion project. You know, it wasn't just some chums having a laugh and kicking around with a film camera.
But, you know, the interesting thing is that, having said all of that, that it's both, you know. Yeah. I mean, because they were good friends. They are good friends. I mean, they always say they want to work together again. And so there is an element, and also the central, well, I mean, it's a romantic comedy, but it's debatable whether the romance is really between Shaun and Liz, or whether it's between Shaun and Nick Frost's character. Because in many ways, the central relationship is between Simon Pegg's character and Nick Frost's character. And that, to a large extent, was based on their own, you know, very brotherly relationship. They really were, you know, best friends, and famously shared a bed for a while when they could, you know, when after Simon Pegg had broken up with his girlfriend, moved in with Nick Frost, and it was cold, and they only had one bed, and they shared a bed for quite a while. And, you know, so from one point of view, it is a group of mates making a movie about being mates and being in you know, going to the pub, which they like to do a lot at the time, especially Nick and Simon. But it was also an incredibly hard thing to pull off.
Yeah. You know, people who don't really make movies, I don't think realize how hard it is even to make, you know, the simplest of movies, you know, and how much work you have to do to even just get, like, you know, 8 minutes of film done. You know, if you've got 8 minutes, sure, but it's a zombie film, you now have to come up with 8 minutes of zombie prosthetics. Who's going to make that, you know? And now you have to multiply that up into a feature where you can't, you know, shut down London forever, where they were filming at the time. And it just becomes I'm sure it becomes a really grueling thing to do.
Yeah, it did. And one of the interesting things was that Edgar, because the film cost £4 million, which is about $7 million, which was a lot of money to give to somebody for what in effect was their debut movie. And but Edgar knew that all of the sort of classic horror movies, if you look at the history of The Evil Dead or the Peter Jackson, the early Peter Jackson movies, they didn't have money, but what they had was time. It took them a long time. I mean, they didn't have time, but eventually they didn't plan on it taking that long. But the first Evil Dead took like 12 weeks or whatever. And for those, you in comparison, people now make films in 2 weeks. I mean, usually not good films. But for example, I often think about this. I was on the set of Bone Tomahawk, which was that Kurt Russell sort of cannibal western, and that's a movie with a great cast. And if you look at it, I mean, it's a good-looking movie with lots of stuff going on. And they shot that in 4 weeks. And you're like, good God, how could they have done that in 4 weeks? But they did. But Edgar was aware that with a movie like this, when you have got a lot of prosthetics, and when you're trying to do things that take time, that you need the time. And I think eventually they shot for about 8 weeks on Shaun of the Dead, which was a really generous period of time for a first-time filmmaker. And that's what cost the money. And I was talking to the producer, Naira Park, and she said they could have relatively easily gotten like £2.5 million to make it, but they needed 4 because they needed 8 weeks, because Edgar knew that if they tried to cut it down, there would be catastrophic. And what's interesting is there is one sequence in the film. I mean, it's several sort of little sequences with several montages strung together, but which is called The Plan. And if you know anything about Shaun of the Dead, or indeed have been on the internet at all for the past couple of years, you'll be familiar with The Plan, which is where Simon Pegg's character Shaun, Nick Frost's character Ed, cook up. They think about what they're going to do. They now realize they're in a zombie movie, essentially. What are they going to do? And they're like, well, we'll go here and we'll go there. We'll pick up Liz. We'll pick up my mum. And eventually this all culminates in, and you're seeing, as they're describing it, you are seeing them doing it. And a series of shots, which would have taken a considerable amount of time to do. And they eventually land on, well, we'll go to the pub and wait for all of this to blow over, right? And this was called The Plan. And this is not a long bit in the movie, and arguably doesn't really add anything to the movie. I mean, from a plot perspective, other than, you could have just done it by Simon saying, well, we'll just pick them up and go to the pub. But it's this incredibly smart and funny and cool way of doing this. But as I said, it doesn't necessarily, from a financier's point of view, it's not really necessarily adding anything to the film, obviously. And Naira told me that people would say, she was always like, this is the first thing people wanted to cut out. What is this plan thing? And this is another aspect of, quite often it's hard for Edgar to explain to people what it is, like his vision, because in many ways his vision has not been seen before. And this was sort of culminating even by Baby Driver. He found it hard to get that off the ground, because it's not a musical, but it is a film set to music in which everything is in the time of the music, and to see exactly what that's going to be like until you've made the film is hard. But Naira would say, well, people were always trying to get us to cut, what is the plan? We've got to lose the plan. And of course, ironically now, 16, 17 years later, you go on Twitter and it's the plan. That's the bit that's, that's the meme, essentially, for Shaun of the Dead. That's one of several, but certainly, during the pandemic, that whole let's go down to the pub and wait for this to blow over, it was all over the internet, to the extent that Edgar had to tweet to remind people that this is not a plan that people should follow, and that in the film, and that in the film, pretty much everybody dies after they try to do this, although at least Shaun was trying. And so, but yes, so, that was that was one of the difficulties of making it, trying to persuade people that every so often he had to get this specific shot of something, which was going to then form part of a montage that was going to appear in a completely different part of the film. And in the end, Edgar started just shooting these things himself with the second unit, with the second cameraman, during his lunch break, sort of before everybody else turned up for work, which is added more to his workload, which was already pretty substantial.
No, yeah.
I'm sorry. Once you get me started about talking about Shaun of the Dead, it's very hard to get me to stop. I've been, for large sections of the pandemic, I've been sitting in a room writing a book about Shaun of the Dead. So I apologize if I go on and on and on.
No. You're totally fine. This is the great kind of stuff that I was hoping that you would have. So how many times at this point have you watched Shaun of the Dead? Do you think?
I would have no idea. I mean, I would have no idea at all. And the truth is, through this process, the answer may be, like, having started this process, the answer may be only once. Like, in terms of, like, from one end to another.
Hmm.
I remember sitting down with my girlfriend. I was like, I think I'm going to write this book. Let's watch Shaun of the Dead. And we watched it. Now, having said which, I've watched little bits of it a lot. Like, I have poured over that film. I mean, cumulatively, I've watched that film a lot. But it's usually been to check some fact, or to remind myself of something, or to look at dialogue. But I've certainly never gotten sick of it. In fact, I mean, even now, if I wanted to cheer myself up for some reason, I'll put on the sequence, the Don't Stop Me Now sequence, where Shaun and Ed and Liz battle the publican of the Winchester, which is the name of the pub where they've gone to sort of hole up, to the sound, to the choreographed sound, or rather they're choreographed to the sound of Queen's Don't Stop Me Now. And I just think that's a perfect little fabulous comedy scene that always kind of cheers me up. And there's a little sort of musical number in the middle of the film, and we just mentioned Baby Driver. In some ways, that's the kind of dry run for Baby Driver, although Edgar would have other dry runs as well. I just think that's just a perfect mix of music and comedy and action to a degree, and choreography. That's, and I just never get tired of that. I never get tired of any of it. I would literally sit down and watch that film now. There's just so much. There's so much in that film. I mean, in all of Edgar's films, really. But I think there's so much in that film that it's not that you find new things every time you watch it, but inevitably you forget some things over the years, and so you discover it again. You discover it, but for a second time or a third time, and you're like, "Oh, I've forgotten that happened."
Yeah, and different jokes hit you at different times, and something can really just take you away and just get you in an absolute fit of laughter.
Yes.
Just depending on the mood that you were in, from one time to another, a joke can really just hit you in the sweet spot.
Well, and also I was just going to say, as you get older as well, because this does, I mean, I was in London, I was living in London. I mean, they perfectly capture Edgar and Simon, that sort of just living in London around the turn of the century kind of feckless 20s vibe. I mean, I never worked in a electronics store like Shaun does, but I was certainly sort of like, what am I going to do? And I got to get my life together. And I to a degree still think that. But that sort of walking to the shop on a Sunday morning and getting the paper, and you're hungover, and walking back. I mean, I've certainly been in a bad enough state on a Sunday morning when I really wouldn't have noticed the apocalypse had happened, which is sort of one of the big jokes of the early part of the movie. And I think, if I'd seen that when I was still living in London in 2004, when the film came out, if I'd still been living in London, I think maybe I would have found it a bit depressing. I mean, I don't mean the film is depressing, but the accuracy of that portrayal with regards to how close it was to my life. But of course, now I kind of look back on it, it seems like a time capsule or something that I look back on quite fondly, really, a sort of more ne'er-do-wellish, early stage of my life, I guess.
Sort of, sort of mischievous youth kind of a thing.
Yeah, very much. Although they think they're being mischievous, just as I thought I was being mischievous, but in fact we were just sort of doing nothing, basically.
Yeah.
Or nothing useful.
Well, and I think that it captures a lot of things very earnestly and very honestly, and from reading the book, that's definitely because so much of it is so grounded in in their personal lives and in who they were and in elements of what formed them up to that point in their life.
Sure.
And so it really makes it a very emotionally rooted story. And I think that that's one of the other reasons that it stood out from other, genre films at the time. 2 years later, after this, Slither came out, and Slither was like a bit of a bomb. And I love Slither,
Right.
and I think Slither's a blast, but Slither doesn't quite have that same ultra rooted emotional core that this one has.
Sure. No, and interestingly, because that's a James Gunn movie, and I think in a strange way, you look at Suicide Squad, which I also really enjoyed, and it's almost like that's more personal to James Gunn than Slither in a strange way, as was the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. It's weird how I mean, I'm a huge fan of James Gunn, but it's almost like the more money they give him, the more personal a movie he is able to make. I was unaware that the James Gunn had I knew James Gunn had this dog that he had like for 16 years and passed away during the filming of Suicide Squad. But in Suicide Squad, Suicide. I get confused now as to which one it is.
It's
anyway,
the Suicide Squad.
The Suicide Squad. This is the one I'm talking about. But I guess they smoke. I only saw this on Instagram the other day, but they have cigars. They smoke cigars in Suicide Squad, as some of the characters do. And the cigars are like branded with photographs of his dog, which you can't really see in the movie, but he was showing pictures on Instagram. And that's not really what we're talking about. I mean, that's not quite the same as the fact that Shaun of the Dead comes out of the lives that its creators were living. I was just like, wow, like he made the decision to, because he was showing pictures of not only the cigars, but the packaging and also the billboards for the cigars that are featured in the film at some point, apparently. And so you're actually talking about, once you're talking about a film on that scale, it's like tens of thousands of dollars, right?
Yeah.
And I guess something, now arguably something has to be on these cigars, and it doesn't really matter what it is. But I was just like, how cool to pay tribute to your dog who may not be with you for much longer by having cigars with his face on it. I just thought that was really quite touching. But the thing about Shaun of the Dead is much like Space. It is impossible to overemphasize how much the stuff in the movie was inspired by real life. I mean, the Winchester pub where the second half of the film is set was directly inspired by this pub called The Shepherds that was down the road from where Simon and Nick lived with Michael Smiley. Michael Smiley is a British comedian and actor who played Tyres, the sort of dance club crazy cycle courier in Space, and actually appears in Shaun of the Dead very briefly as a zombified version of Tyres. So the three of them lived in this house in North London, and their local pub was called The Shepherds. And as Simon said, it wasn't that there were regulars there. He and Nick pretty much lived there, and would sort of take part in the pub quiz. And Edgar was always, while they were writing Shaun of the Dead, Edgar was always like, come into like, fashionable Soho. We'll go for I'm a member of the Groucho Club, which is a well-known private members bar in Soho. Yeah, we'll go out for dinner there or whatever. And Simon and Nick were like, no, we're going to stay in the Shepherds, which even they were, we're going to stay in the Shepherds and we won't visit you in your home, even though you live a couple of miles away. We won't come into town. We're just going to stay there. And it was funny because Edgar, Simon and Nick really do talk about it as this wonderful place. And then I interviewed Edgar, and Edgar was like, it was just nothing special. It was just that it was round the corner from where they lived, And in fact, I one of the people I interviewed was Marcus Rowland, who's the production designer of the film, and whose kind of job was to create the Winchester at Ealing Studios. And he was telling me that he went to Simon and Nick's local pub, and he was like, it was just really boring. You couldn't you couldn't put that on screen. It was like I had to invent the pub myself, because the pub that it was based on, there was just nothing special about it. but it was, it was in that pub where Simon and Nick would sort of talk about if there was they were both horror fans. They would say, if there's a zombie outbreak, what are we going to do? And, they'd have elaborate plans about going from their house to the local. There aren't many gun shops in England at all. But there was one, happened to be one down the road from them, and they would go over the roofs and they would somehow get into the gun shop, and they always fantasize that the basement of the gun shop, there would be like special guns. And then they would grab these special guns and then go to the pub and, hole up there. And as Simon was telling me this, he was like, and that became the plot of the film. That's this fantasy that they had in the pub about, surviving a zombie apocalypse in the pub, was then turned into a film that then became this sort of global phenomenon. It really is quite remarkable. And there are bits throughout the whole film that, are inspired by the way they were living, or things that Edgar did, or the relationships they'd had, and so on and so forth. It's a zombie film, but it's incredibly autobiographical. It's quite fascinating. And it's a zombie film that's both autobiographical and incredibly original in what it is, while still, there's in-jokes all over the place referring to George Romero's zombie movies and Lucio Fulci and all sorts. So it's funny. The more I talk about it, the more I think it's such a remarkable film in so many ways.
It is. And you were talking about it being a remarkable trilogy, and I definitely think that it is, because on top of them just being, technical, masterful films, it is because all of them do have that great grounded core, that great grounded heart. And I think that it always pours through in each of the films. Growing up, I had a friend who was who started living with me and my family when we were in school together, and he's now essentially my brother. He's a part of the family, and so those parts of those stories always really hit home for he and I, especially because they were coming out when we were teenagers and like going through all of that. And so I think that always really grounds it. And I think that that's what makes just the whole Cornetto trilogy, or the Blood and Ice Cream trilogy, so special, is that element to it.
Yeah. And it's become a phenomenon all around the world, which is it's interesting, because I do think Americans particularly, there are things that are so British that Americans just don't want to have anything to do with it. They just cannot comprehend what's going on. I guess cricket would be number one on that list. But then there are things that are so British, but in a way that just makes, whether it's Downton Abbey or Shaun of the Dead, that just really takes the fancy of so many Americans. I went to see a screening I think it was in Philadelphia, of when The World's End came out. That they played The World's End, and I think maybe Hot Fuzz in Philadelphia. And I just went down because I was in New York at the time, and it seemed like a fun time. And Simon and Edgar and Nick were doing a screening, and I was talking to some people in line to go to see the movies, and there was this couple whose house had burned down the day before. Like the day before, their house had burned down, but they had tickets to see like The World's End and Hot Fuzz, and so they were in line. And it's funny though, and I remember mentioning this to Simon a couple of days later, and not unkindly, he did say, "Well, what do you expect them to do? Sit around in the rubble of their house?" which is a good point, but you'd kind of think that maybe they had things to do, to sort their life out, rather than going to see a couple of films in the Cornetto trilogy. But it just delights me, and I know that Edgar and Simon and Nick, every time they would release one of the Cornetto movies, they would go on these huge promotional tours, and they would do a month in America, just touring around as if they were like a rock band, essentially. And I know how delighted Edgar and Simon were that they'd sort of turn up in Detroit, and there would be a full screening for some movie, for their movie, which was all, shot in the exteriors, shot in like Crouch End and different parts of North London, and reflected their lives in living in North London. And yet people in America were just delighted by it, and it kind of warms my heart really to think of all these people around the world just really digging, Shaun of the Dead and the other movies.
Are you thinking about doing your own sort of Cornetto trilogy and doing the written history of Hot Fuzz and World's End as well?
Well, obviously, the thought had occurred to me, but one, let's see if people have said some nice things, and people who have read the book seem to be enjoying it, but I don't know. The film is a big success. Those films over time particularly have become big successes. I don't know if people necessarily want to read a book about each of the movies. I hope they do. Say that I kind of cover. There is a sort of final chapter where I sort of describe what the principals have done over the past 15 years, which kind of covers Hot Fuzz and The World's End to some degree. Partly because I was going to end it with the death of George Romero, who was such a huge influence on this film, and then asked Simon and Edgar to cameo as zombies in Land of the Dead. Edgar and Simon and George Romero became friends over the years. And Edgar spoke at George Romero's, after George Romero died, they had a ceremony to give him his star on the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. And Edgar spoke at that ceremony, and it just seemed, and it was Edgar talking while, like, I think 3 zombies are in front of him, sort of just sort of standing there, just sort of shambling from side to side. And it seemed like a lovely final moment. Because there's much talk in the book about fast zombies and slow zombies, and how Edgar and Simon particularly will have no truck with fast zombies. So it seemed like a sort of a nice final, and the book starts with Simon and Edgar waiting to see what George thinks about Shaun of the Dead. They set up the special screening for George, and you eventually discover that George loves it. But so it seemed like a nice ending. And then while I was writing the book, the pandemic happened. And as I said earlier, there were suddenly, particularly in the UK, there were all these, Shaun of the Dead, this zombie virus film suddenly seemed to be part of the culture again. And so I wanted to, bring it right up to date. And that's why I thought, let's talk about Hot Fuzz and The World's End, etc. Hot Fuzz would be a great one to do, just because, as I said, it would be a nice excuse to go back to where I grew up. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, and I think maybe Edgar's had I think Edgar the break from me over the next 2 years. So we'll see. I have ideas for a different book that a completely different. A film unconnected with Edgar and Simon and Nick.
Okay.
Which I'm not going to name here.
No, for sure. You don't want to hatch anything before it's ready.
No.
So any last thoughts that you would like to I guess share with the listeners on Shaun of the Dead? Maybe for those who haven't seen it yet, or for those who have, anything.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting. I don't know how I would prepare someone to watch it. It's a film definitely that, as we were talking about it before, rewards repeated watching. But there's that thing nowadays where people will say, "You've got to see this TV show. It gets great by episode 8," and you're like, "Well, I'm not sure I have the time to watch 7 hours of not great TV." And I don't mean that it's just it isn't really helpful to say to someone, well, if you don't like Shaun of the Dead the first time you watch it, you'll love it by the time, like, the 17th time you watch it. I mean, that's not a very practical scenario. And the truth is, I think most people would enjoy watching Shaun of the Dead. Although it's interesting because it is a horror movie. Like, if you don't like horror movies, then it is a horror movie, and it's deliberately a horror movie. I mean, Simon always says that it's not a parody of horror movies, it's a parody of rom-coms, and it's a serious horror movie, and it is. And there are moments towards the end that are as scary and as gruesome as you'll find in any horror movie, I think. But having said which, I think there's a lot for I mean, it's not like watching, some absolutely grim, relentless horror film. I don't know. I mean, people should check it out. I will say it's a film. I think it becomes apparent whether you're going to vibe with it or not pretty early on.
Yeah.
But I just love it. I love them all absolutely to bits. And I did think there would come a point where I'd grow tired of watching it, and that's just not the case. As I said earlier on, I'd happily watch it right now.
No, yeah. Yesterday, my wife and I watched it, and then we sat down and we watched it with the commentary, one of the commentary tracks right after. And it was a great movie, and it was a great commentary track. It's a great experience. It's a lot of, especially as you read the book and that kind of thing, it's a lot of very hard work that had incredible payoff. So no, I think that's fair. It is something that definitely rewards repeated viewership. It's so detail rich. When I was watching it this last time, I realized that when Liz and Shaun are sitting on the couch at the end, they've got this little display behind them that has pictures of Barbara, Philip, and Diane, but David is not photographed. And so, I really enjoy
right.
It's a very detail-rich movie. There's a lot of visual detail to it.
I will say, just as a little one thing I absolutely didn't know before investigating this, before writing the book, is a lot of the casting choices, a lot of the people that could have been in the movie I was unaware of. Particularly, as you say, David, the character of David, who Dylan Moran plays quite brilliantly. There was a lot of, it was one of those, I think there's at least 3 roles in the film that are named after the people that they thought who would play them. So Pete, who is the roommate of Shaun, is called Pete because they wanted Pete Serafinowicz to play him. And Peter Serafinowicz does play him. But David was written for David Walliams, who would later on become quite famous as one half of Little Britain with Matt Lucas, hugely popular British comedy show, and in fact couldn't play David in Shaun of the Dead because he was filming the first season of Little Britain. So they had to audition other people, and there's quite a few people that they thought about. But one thing that made me laugh is that there is a British actor called Shaun Harris, who is now most famous for being the villain, the utterly terrifying villain in not 1 but 2, I think, Mission Impossible movies. Mm-hmm. And he is, if you people listening to this Google Shaun Harris, they'll know who I'm talking about. I guess to a certain extent he's one of those guys, quote unquote, those guys, character actors, but he's always playing these utterly terrifying people, and he's a very, very intense actor. And I remember Edgar saying, yeah, we auditioned Shaun Harris, who was great, but he was completely terrifying. So which was not what we had in mind for the role at all. So, and in the end, they cast Dylan Moran, who it all worked out well.
No, yeah, I mean, the cast is just stupendous. Shaun Harris would have been quite the interesting casting choice.
Yes,
he
yes,
would have been a
yes.
very different energy. No, I think that that's great. So what are some other projects that you're working on now? Where are some places that people can read more of your work, you know, that kind of thing?
Well, they can read it pretty regularly on EW.com. We were talking about the Suicide Squad earlier on, and I wrote a big feature about that about a couple of months ago, which was a lot of fun. I did a cover story for Entertainment Weekly a couple of months ago on Ted Lasso. So I visited the Ted Lasso set in West London, which was a lot of fun. I mean, as usual, I'm talking to a lot of horror people. Usually around Halloween, or sort of 6 months leading up to Halloween, I'll start asking sort of horror notables what they think the scariest movie of all time is. But I've done that for a few years, but I've now sort of asked a lot of people that. So instead, this year I decided to ask them what the first movie that scared the shit out of them was. Exactly in that way. And I have to say, the thing about asking people their favorite horror movie, or scariest horror movie, is there's a lot of ums and ahs, and quite reasonably, you know, and people aren't really sure what answer to give. But if you ask them what the first movie that scared the shit out of them was, they've got an answer right there. Every one of them has like a creation tale, and whether it's Bruce Campbell or M. Night Shyamalan or Jamie Lee Curtis, they're all like, "Oh yeah, no, I remember," and that's been quite fascinating. I think The Exorcist is maybe, you know, in terms, if there was a poll, would be the one that most terrified people. M. Night Shyamalan told me that he slept in his parents' bed for like a week after seeing it. And what's also, it's also, you usually see these things like accidentally, or not accidentally, but it's like, no, I went round to some elderly relative's house and they like went to sleep, and suddenly I'm watching Poltergeist at the age of 6. And then there's, what's interesting with with a lot of these people, the same story. They accidentally see like Poltergeist or The Exorcist or whatever, and then they cannot see a horror movie for 10 years. They're like so traumatized. Or even, I can't think who it was, but someone was talking about The Fly terrorizing them, the Cronenberg version, and how they couldn't even see anything. Not only couldn't they see a horror movie, they couldn't see a movie with Jeff Goldblum, like for like 10 years. And then eventually they sort of circle around and start digging into this thing, this subject, which is so much as a kid. So I find it's remarkable how similar a lot of these stories are, except for Jamie Lee Curtis, who just flat out hates horror movies. I mean, in terms of, not the ones she doesn't like hate horror movies in the way that people, you know, she said she scares too easily. She can't watch them at all. She was talking about watching The Mayor of Easttown under a pillow. And that's not, I mean, I really like Mayor of Easttown. It's not that scary a show, I would suggest.
Okay. No, that's all great. I like that question. I'm not sure what I would say my favorite horror film is. The first movie that definitely gave, you know, me like a fright as a kid was probably Jaws.
Right. Right.
I saw that at like a friend across the street's house and had nightmares after Jaws. So
well, also,
that's a
I
good
feel,
one.
especially in America, that's just on cable all the time, like wallpaper. I think people. No, but you know what I mean. There's like, it's like they stretch it out to 4 hours with ads for gardening implements in between, and forget the possibility that some kid is going to be there, and it's like 2:30 in the afternoon, and they suddenly face the Jaws, which is you know, quite a movie. I remember going to see. I don't really have a. I went to see. My dad, for some reason, took me to see The Island of Dr. Moreau, the Michael York version. This must have been when I was like 8 or 9 years old, in Somerset, where I grew up. And I've never revisited this film because I suspect it's not very good, but there were moments in it that really terrified me. And I remember there was some scene, I mean, possibly I'm misremembering it, where Michael York is poking around the doctor's laboratory, and there's some like body under a sheet, and the body's breathing, and it's like Michael York's getting closer and closer. And I remember saying to my dad, like, I gotta go. This is scaring the hell out of me. Like, I gotta go. I can't bear to see this. And he said, well, that's fine, but if we leave, we're leaving. Like, we're leaving the building and we're going home. We're not like hanging around in the foyer for this scary moment to be over. So if you want to go, we can go, but that'll be the end of it. and so I stayed because my interest in what was going to happen next outweighed my sort of fear of what was going to happen next. And I often think, like, if I'd left, maybe I could be prime minister at this point, or a successful barrister or lawyer or something else. But I'm pretty happy with the way things turned out.
No, yeah, I mean, you get to cover something that you find fascinating and meet people that make some great stuff. So it definitely could have turned out worse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got a great job. I got no complaints.
One last question. If you had to give Shaun of the Dead one thing that every time you see it you go, it's not for me. Is there anything in there? Is there one thing?
There is. I will say there's one joke. There's one joke I actually don't like. And I don't really understand it. And it's possible I just don't understand it. I don't really like it. I don't want to say what it is, not because I'm worried about offending anybody, but I'm worried that someone somewhere, that's when they watch it, that's the thing that will trip them up. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. They'll be like, oh, yeah. Or maybe they'll think I'm an idiot. That's a hilarious joke. But I think it's close to being a perfect film, I have to say.
Okay.
For my money. It's a great looking movie. I mean, every time I watch it, I think it's just a better movie. I mean, I remember it very fondly, but I'm always amazed at quite how good it is. There's almost no, there's almost nothing to complain about it at all.
No, yeah.
And maybe I just misunderstand that one joke, I have to say.
No, yeah, absolutely. Humor is partly, a cultural understanding as well. For a joke to pay off, you have to understand, where that joke is coming from. So, no, I think it's definitely a near perfect film. I definitely would give it like a 4.5 out of 5. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. You've already been very generous coming on.
This has been, I have to say, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. And if people are interested, they can pre-order the book now. And it's going to be published October 19th.
Yes, the book comes out October. I've got some promotional stuff that he sent over. I'm going to post it on the website along with the episode as well. And I'll put a link to like a pre-order page as well somewhere. So, yeah, thank you, honestly, so much. You're welcome to come back on anytime that you want to talk about something.
Fantastic. Well, we'll do one of the others next time.
Yeah, sounds
we'll do
great.
The Hot Fuzz, or I can tell you, we'll do Hot Fuzz, and I can keep on going. Oh, we'll do a commentary track just of me being like, that's where I used to buy the Sunday papers. Well, that was my local supermarket. There you go.
Sort of like a Mystery Science 3000 kind of thing.
Absolutely.
No, honestly, that sounds great. Thank you so much again, honestly.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine.
Hey, buds. Paul again. That was Clark Collis talking with me about Shaun of the Dead and his book, You've Got Red on You. Shaun of the Dead, for those who don't know, is the 2004 film written and directed by Edgar Wright, co-written by Simon Pegg, starring Simon Pegg, Kate Ashfield, Nick Frost, Lucy Davis, Dylan Moran, Peter Serafinowicz, Rafe Spall, Bill Nye, and Penelope Wilton. It's, something of a cult classic. It's got a pretty straightforward plot. A man's uneventful life is disrupted by the zombie apocalypse, and it's available for rent, pretty much everywhere. It's a great little special film, and I really urge everyone to watch it, and I really can't thank Clark again for coming on. Next week, we're going to have Kind of Like the Movies for you with Candyman and Adjustment Bureau. Just as sort of a parallel to the recent releases, Reminiscing and Candyman as well. So thanks again for tuning in. We look forward to having you back, of course, as well next week. And I also plan on talking next week in greater detail about the new Spider-Man trailer, which just dropped, and all of the news that has come out of CinemaCon and maybe even a little bit of Gamescom. So be sure to check out next week. Thanks again for tuning in this week. Thanks again to Clark. Who knows, maybe one day I'll do a roundtable with Clark and Allison and someone else as well. But thanks again for listening, folks. Have a good one. Bye.